Yeah, when you think about the possible Final Four, it's so exciting. And Maggie, you can come in here. Love you too. Maggie Murphy, CEO at Lewis FC. Of course, it got to the FA Cup quarter final this season. Sits on the WSL board. Hi, Maggie.
Hello, good morning.
What a great thing this is, isn't it? It really is. It's wonderful.
I've just been smiling listening to everyone's contributions from around the world and just shows how hyped everyone is for it and how much the visibility has grown and people have their favorite teams, their favorite players, they're invested emotionally as well as commercially now these days. So yeah, it's just brilliant to see that it's getting that visibility that it deserves.
Yeah, and of course, as we just got that mentioned there from Jess in Adelaide, that when it gets down to the that's quite a terrible phrase actually, but I'll use it to the business end of the tournament. You're looking at the possible Final Four. That's going to be, oh my goodness me, that's going to be nerve-wracking because they are such good teams, and there's not much to choose, is there, between them?
There's not. I think that makes it exciting, and I think it's that level of competitiveness and competition, and the fact that we don't know who's going to win. Even the group stages, I think, are going to be very, very interesting, very tasty, and that's what we want. We don't want there to be teams that are going to fly through. We don't want there to be games that show a huge disparity, and there might be one or two, but I think it just shows that what's happening on the world stage is also, filtering down into the national level as well, on a domestic level, because you want those competitive games. You want there to be fight, and that shows increased investment is going to get you there as well.
Yeah, and one thing leads to another. Success breeds success, doesn't it? And as for Serena Wigman, she's, as we heard earlier on, she's a master tactician, and I think when England were playing Spain in that Euro quarter final, she changed the formation, didn't she? And that changed the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Serena Wigman has been probably one of the biggest assets for the England team over the last couple of years. She knows what she's doing, but not just tactically, but you can really see that there's a cohesion and a culture that's developed in the team. And I don't think you're going to win anything unless you've got that culture and that cohesion. So I'm really intrigued as to whether that will be able to last, because it was obviously very, very strong last summer. But you've obviously had a number of players that have swapped in. So can you carry that culture and that cohesion? Because otherwise it won't work.
And how do you do that?
Well, I think that you've got to make sure that players are able to be their whole selves. They have to be able to bring their whole part of their personality and identity to the table, and that might mean being vulnerable. So if a player is struggling with their mental health or with a family issue, if you try and hide that, it just means that people won't understand why you're not performing on the pitch. If you're able to be vulnerable with that, and you need a very, very safe environment to do that, if you've got that safe environment, then you're going to be able to have players that are understanding why you might be playing in a particular way, or you've got a coach that understands the human side, not just the technical or tactical side. And I think the other thing is treating players as individuals, understanding that some kinds of methods that you use for some players are going to be different than the ones you use for other players. So I think it's that safe environment that you need to create.
But the great coaches, they have that psychological brilliance. They have that human touch. They understand individuals as individuals. So it's about mutual trust and also honesty.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that also comes to the wider ecosystem. You can have great tactical nous, you can have that great environment, which allows players to be themselves, but you also need that investment around everything else. You have to have the best kind of support in place, whether that's your medical performance side, where you've got your media side that's attuned to what the players want and not what they think they want, perhaps by using men's football as a template. We need to kind of step away from that and be using women's football as a template, create our own template. And so that medical, the commercial side, the media
So
side.
what do you mean by a template? Sorry, just explain what you mean by that, moving away from the men's template. That's
Well, I think
really interesting, Maggie.
Yeah, I think at the moment, a lot of the time, women's football, when it gets a little bit of investment, it tends to borrow from the men's side of a club or a nation. And so therefore you have the media team that focuses on men's football, provide their social media manager for a day. And then what you end up having is kind of GIFs or photos that are actually quite masculine in the way that they're presented. And if you ask my own players, when they go to some of the photo shoots that they're asked to go to, they're often asked to, cross their arms and stare moodily down the camera.
Oh,
And
interesting.
actually, they want to kind of, they want to laugh about, they want to be themselves. And I think sometimes we impose kind of those men's the way that we do it, and it's not anybody's fault, but when you're borrowing resources rather than having your own dedicated resources that are really invested in women's football and developing that character, and I think you're going to see that at the World Cup this year, because you've got an incredible number of brand new partners and sponsors that are now flooding into the game for the first time. You've got Xero, for example, that is this partner that has never been interested in men's football, never been interested in women's football, but is now going to sponsor the Women's World Cup, but is also thinking about legacy and is partnering with us on a longer term basis back home. And that really shows that there are brands out there that are being very, very conscious that this is a long-term thing. This is about building a platform and building something longer term, and not just coming in for a one-off event, not just coming in for a very quick return on investment, but actually trying to build something stronger and cohesively together.
That's so interesting, Maggie. It's about, breaking away from the culture of the men's game and, in a sense, some of the tropes of the men's game as well. And but I think, that's underway, isn't it?
It is for sure, but it takes a bit of time. So we often compare men's and women's football, and I wish that we didn't.
But they're different games. I think one of the great things about the women's game is it's so open, and it's great to watch.
But I also think that one of the challenges is that if we do that comparison, because we've been watching men's football live and on television for decades, it means that we almost have this assumption that that's the pinnacle and that's what we're aiming for. And it means that we often measure women's football success by men's football indicators. And that might be by the commercial dollar, or it might be by the viewing figures. But we don't actually ever think about the indicators that women's football is doing better than men's football and hold men's football up to women's football. And that could be things like the amount of time that the ball is in play. It's higher in women's football than men's football. Or it could be the fact that fans of women's sport are more likely to spend money on a sponsor of women's sport than fans of men's sport are to spend their money on a sponsor of men's sport. And of course, then there's the LGBT inclusion, which is much better on and off the pitch in women's sport. And you've got also a lot less toxicity in fan base. So there's so many areas where actually women's football is doing this so much better. But we never kind of look at men's football and say, hey, what are you doing to catch up to women's standards? I think that's one of our biggest challenges, that we're using the wrong KPIs sometimes when we're judging women's sport by whether it's got to an appropriate level.
The toxicity, the fan toxicity, that's a fascinating point as well, because you're coming from a different place, aren't you?
I think so. I think that, funnily enough, when you look back to the Lionesses' success last year, when I walked down Wembley Way, it was full of people that were the most representative of our nation possible. There was men, women, there were boys, there were girls, there were groups of teenagers hanging out, there were groups of older fans that were coming together, there were women in headscarves, there were like teenage boys in baseball caps. It was a very much a very representative of our nation. And I think if you look at men's football, from time to time, you don't have that level of diversity. When you have that diversity, then it means that you have less toxicity, because you have to be more inclusive of the people that are around you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Maggie Murphy, CEO at Lewis FC.